paved with technology and rockets alone. It's built on the dreams, risk, and relentless spirit of those who dare look up and say, we belong there. For over 30 years, the Space Frontier Foundation has been a home for these visionary, radical, action-oriented individuals. Hear their stories, learn how space was shaped, and revel in the revolution of commercial space pioneers. Bob Werb, co-founder of the Space Frontier Foundation. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me and, by extension, all the space enthusiasts that will be at some point watching this discussion. For folks that don't know Bob already, he was one of the visionaries that got this whole Space Frontier Foundation started. And Bob, the questions that I want to the stories that I want to draw out of you is, what was your experience like? How did you come up with making some of the decisions that you did way back in the 80s? What was life like for you, and how did you make the decisions to kind of push space forward as much as you did? So if you'd like, you can share some of your background, but you don't have to.
I'll share very limited about my background. I retired for the first time when I was a little over 30, and I went sailing with my wife and my toddler. And we did that for about a year. When I decided to go back to the real world, I had been a real estate developer doing shopping centers, office buildings, suburban garden apartments, and I made enough money to retire early. But I decided.
So you were in the other space.
Yes.
You were, when people say space industry, a lot of times people think renting space, but you were in that space industry.
Both space industries. And before that, I had helped start the New Jersey L5s and then after the Space Studies Institute. I was certainly aware of the problems. And I went and interviewed for a job at the NSS and came down to the final two people, Laurie Garber or I. A gentleman named Charlie Walker definitely chose the right person when he chose Laurie, because he worked for McDonnell Douglas and I was probably dangerous to their interests. I really wanted to do something about space. And of course, I already knew Rick and Jim and many other people in the community. We decided we needed to create another organization. Trying to fix the organizations that we had, and therefore for different purposes, didn't make much sense. We should start a new one. I agreed to spend every Wednesday sitting in an office on the Intrepid, which is an aircraft carrier in New York Harbor. And we had a really nice office, no windows, below decks. But they gave us a nice free office, buried in the bowels of the ship. And it was quiet, and there was a phone. And I took my route both the limited contact list and Jim and Rick's more extensive contact list, and I called up everybody on the list and asked them what they thought. And everybody had pretty much the same analysis, which is that we weren't, that we were going nowhere fast. And we brought a bunch of people together on board the Intrepid. We actually used a room which hadn't been used since the 1940s. It was last used for briefing pilots. And when I asked for a room to have a meeting in, they said, if you clean that room, you can use it. So Rick found some volunteers who came in and cleaned the room. After that, we created the foundation. All this was in 1988. We didn't word it this way at the time, with the goal of changing the conversation about space.
So let me ask, first of all, let me ask,
but that was the goal.
If you haven't read Laurie's book, I'm sure you probably have, but yeah. You were both up for that NSS job.
Yes.
And she had worked in the organization from kind of come up from it. What were you, so you had your business real estate career, and then you came into, and you were offering your leadership to the organization. What was it you were hanging your application or your resume on at that point?
I just applied for the job. They advertised for the job and I applied. As happened, I knew many of the people that were on the search committee, or at least they knew
through L5 experience?
Through L5, and somewhat through SSI as well. I had actually been more active in space studies in L5 because I lived in New Jersey. I lived in Piscataway, not far from there. So I was more involved there. And I think Laurie was clearly the safer choice, and it worked out well because, I went off to do other things. Worked out well for me too, because I went back to the business and continued to do real estate for another 20 years. What
would you have, just out of curiosity, so you already said Laurie was the better choice. If she hadn't taken the job, what do you think, how is your philosophy about space? And again, I'm asking you about an interview you had several years ago.
Many years ago.
Do you have an idea of what your kind of mind space was?
I had a very open mind at the time. Of course, I came out of the business world, so I naturally had that sort of orientation. The organization had very significant financial problems at the time, and a lot of the interviewing was about that and how you deal with that. Ultimately, the decision was made to deal with that by bringing a lot of money from the aerospace community, which I would not have done because I didn't have those skills. I would have sought money from other types of sources. I had no idea whether it worked or not. It was clearly the risky approach.
How many other business minds did you feel like were in the general pool of these different organizations? Like, if you present yourself as the guy who's the entrepreneur and the business guy, how many of your counterparts were scientists and engineers or defined themselves that way versus people that were looking at a business lens or using a business lens?
What's interesting is that all of us, including the artists and lawyers and business types, are all people who are very comfortable with the language of math, science, and engineering. And my background's in business. My undergraduate degree was in biology, and some very skilled people, teachers, tried to teach me to be a scientist. Failure was because they were dealing with bad raw material, not because of who they're teaching. Clearly, I wasn't destined to be a scientist. I was in grad school before I realized that, but it was not my destiny. And I think that remains a problem to this day, is that we all come from that sort of orientation. Even when you work with the artists we work with, they're all people who are very comfortable with that language. There were a few other folks who had a business background who were around, but mostly they were people with engineering overwhelmingly dominates. Of course, Jim, Rick, and I were intentionally not engineers. It was a decision made for the three of us to not be engineers.
And this is phenomenal. I did not have that piece that you had been like in that consideration. So that's really interesting. And I think your observation that the right sort of pairing seems to have worked out. So before you get to the Intrepid, right, before Muncie and Tumlinson convince you to give up your Wednesdays, where was that relative to this first retirement? Was that okay?
When I came back, within weeks after I came back, I was talking to Jim and Rick and trying to figure out what to do.
So there's a younger Bob. He has less hair somehow.
Actually, I had short hair at the time.
Most people, you say it goes the other way around. I had more hair back then. You actually have more hair now. How did that Bob interact with family and friends that weren't believers in space? Were you the guy at the cocktail party that was always talking about space stuff? How did you interact with the non-space people at that time, if you can recall?
By the time we started the foundation, I'd mostly given up on talking to people about space. They really didn't want to hear what I had to say. They came to it with all sorts of bad biases. And I knew that what I was doing wasn't working, and I didn't yet know how to talk. It took me many years to figure out how to talk to the non-technological but educated people. And I think that's the biggest challenge in front of us now, is how to speak to that group of people.
So it was space as a dirty secret, maybe? Or, I mean, and by the way, you are, I think, correct. That is still a challenge. How did it make you feel? I hate to go to how did it make you feel, but how did it make?
I was very angry.
Angry.
I know it's hard to imagine, but I really was an angry young man. I was very angry, and I was constantly repressing the anger.
Was that anger at a universe that was heading down the wrong path, or is that anger at systems, or just anger at something else?
Well, anger at what space, at what we were doing in space or not doing in space. By the 1980s, Apollo had worn off, and civil space had become almost completely driven by corporate politics. Not just in the U.S., the civil space programs around the world. Yep. Legislators would say they're protecting jobs, while directing billions of dollars to government contractors who expected to kick back some of those funds into the legislators' campaign. And since getting millions in kickbacks requires building billions in spending, civil space budgets grew while civil space accomplishments lagged. I mean, it's literally true to say that we're flying around in circles waiting for shuttles to fall out of the sky. That's precisely what we were doing. That was the program in the 1980s.
And it was successful in serving some interests, but not
in serving the interests of the companies and legislators who were playing that game.
So out of curiosity, all right, so back at that time, this is good. Did you envision breaking somehow that reinforcement system, or injecting a new point in that system that would provide more capability.
I don't want to speak for the others, but I definitely felt that it was hopeless. I don't feel that way today, but at the time I felt that breaking the pork cycle was beyond our capacity. And the reason we achieved so much by changing the conversation about space is we did it in ways that created room for new space to rise and grow, while leaving plenty of room for the porkers to get what they want.
And say more about that.
What I wanted to do is kind of change the pork to program ratio. At the time, it was almost all pork and almost no program. Today, there's a little bit of program mixed in with the pork. This is a big achievement. Okay, much better than before, but still mostly pork. And the challenge before us is to figure out how to get a civil space program, again, not just in the US, that are more programmed than pork. And that's a huge challenge, and that's what sits in front of us now.
When that debate, so we've gone through your Wednesdays on the Intrepid, and you're kind of formulating what are the things that changing the conversation sort of thing. It seemed like you had a focus on penetrating media coverage of space. Is that
yes?
Accurate? Okay.
We quickly realized that the media was our friend, that we had a message that they generally wanted to hear, and that resonated with lots of people who were interested in space. You know, it was a problem that didn't resonate outside the space community, but that's okay. I mean, because we were trying to change the conversation within the space community to create room for what we ultimately came to call new space. And, you know, we started doing a petition drive, you know, return to the moon, this time we stay. We did a lot of radio talk shows.
That might actually be happening here in a few years, right? So that going to the moon to stay.
Maybe.
But you were trying to find stuff that was going to hit a little bit faster than 4 decades.
Well, we were trying to change minds. We were really trying to get we didn't really think we'd get a program to return to the moon in any meaningful time. And personally, I'm not that interested in going to the moon or to Mars, and I don't really see the point of it. But
personally, corporally yourself, or when you say you're not interested, like from a business perspective, not interest, or just like corporally, you don't need to be putting boots.
Yeah, I don't need to be. I'm not interested in going into space. I also, I question, one of the things I question about the way we talk about space is that we just assume that the taxpayer should be paying for this. And it's not clear to me that there's any benefit to the taxpayer for going to Mars and Moon. Luna and Mars do not seem to have much of a payback as far as taxpayer is concerned. I understand why Elon wants to go die on the moon, not on impact. I get that, but he should pay his own way. I don't know why he thinks that the government should help pay for it. To me, that's a mystery. And if you can't and the community can't convince me, how are you going to convince people who are just opposed to technology and science? I just don't see the public purpose. And I think that when you take money from people by force or the threat of force, they ought to get something back for it. And like many of our tax dollars, we're not getting anything back. Just spend it.
More than just Velcro and Tang.
Neither Velcro or Tang actually came from the space program. So there's two lies. We're not going to sell space selling spin-offs that actually weren't spin-offs, and because after all, other types of science has much more in the way of spin-offs. Space technology has a bad history of spin-offs. If spin-offs is your best argument, you have no argument.
But do you think most people think then or now that way?
I think very few people care about space. Probably maybe a tenth of the population cares about space. And what troubles me is that I talk to people all the time who are big supporters of the militaries and have no idea that their military is completely dependent on assets in space. I talk to environmentalists all the time who have no idea that all the data we have on the planet comes from space. It's not that we couldn't collect it on the Earth. We could. It just costs a lot more money and be much lower quality data. We're going to have any hope of understanding the planet Earth, we need space assets. If we're going to have any hope of not losing the next wars, we need space assets. One of my favorite questions I love to ask of military types is, imagine you were a first lieutenant with a platoon in South Vietnam and suddenly there's no satellites. What's your situation? And they'll tell you, oh, well, we don't know where we are. We're supposed to have paper maps. We've never practiced with them. If we have them, we have no secure communications. We can use our cell phones and cell phone towers out there. And then they'll say, and it'll be a few days before there are new satellites up. And they say, no, there won't. It'll be a lot more than a few days before new satellites are up. Oh, and they can take those out easily too. And they don't know that. I mean, they totally don't know that.
Really? Interesting.
Because,
I mean, again,
they're not in the Space Command. They're, Army or Air Force, right? The Space Command knows that. The military is very compartmentalized.
Yeah. All right.
I assume people, generals know that. I assume.
And some folks that are tasked with finding solutions may know it, but the regular folk in the bulk of the organization maybe are not aware. Like, how many people are aware of it? This is a space device.
Yes.
A good chunk of its functionality comes, and that's just a regular cell phone, because of the GPS, but people don't think of it as a space device. And so therefore maybe don't place a whole lot of value on space. Let me challenge that people don't care about space. You can buy, I see NASA meatball t-shirts everywhere. And I don't know if that's just because I'm in the industry, but it seems to be the sort of thing you can buy at Target and Walmart. Like, there is a lot of enthusiasm for space.
NASA has a great brand, but it's a brand that's about history. It's a brand that's about history. It's a brand that's about Apollo. The NASA brand is tied to the past.
Yes, I mean,
it's not about the future. It's in your background. This is a better background, more current.
I've got
a web picture.
There's a Maston vehicle picture over.
Yeah, I see the Maston vehicle up here too.
But all right, you're looking at this system, and you need to change the conversation, and you realize that the petitions thing isn't necessarily the way to go. How did you come to the conclusion of being a media influencer decades before influencer was a job?
You use the tools that are available. And the tools that were available to us were fax machines and lists of media outlets. I would create these one-page faxes saying we're offering a speaker, and then Rick would go talk on these radio shows for 3 or 5 minutes. And we did a lot of them. And eventually I got volunteers to feed the fax machine. And then a few years later, I got a modem that was a fax machine. Boy, was that an upgrade. Send a bunch of them at once. Use the tools that you have, and the tools we have are fax machines and telephones.
Was your approach at the time an expert or a divergent opinion? Like, were you trying to create controversy by offering
with both? And we did much better with creating controversy. We got the most attention. We looked for a hook that we could say something outrageous about. And Scuttle the Shuttle is being a perfect example. Within months of us writing a press release saying Scuttle the Shuttle, the phrase Scuttle the Shuttle was on the front page of The Economist. And a year after that, the shuttle was scuttled. Or at least it was announced that it was scuttled.
And did that destroy your career? Did that destroy your business?
No, I'm in the real estate business. It didn't affect shopping centers at all. And it didn't affect the foundation much one way or the other. Our donors didn't seem to care. The volunteers didn't seem to care. Nobody seemed to care much. There were donors at the time who gave anonymously because they were afraid that they'd be pushed back. I'm not aware of anybody who had much pushback in their careers. And a number of people, as you know, a number of people inside the agency in the US were very supportive.
Yes.
And not so much in the other space.
And this, by the way, is one of the evolutions of the entire industry, which is largely thanks to the work that you were doing, is there are now other companies and other approaches from, differing from that local maxima that had been reached of large aerospace companies. There's now this new higher local maxima that we're settling in, but now there's something to lose, right? There are companies, there are people that have jobs, that have livelihood in that. And so one of the challenges is trying to figure out, are there repercussions? And you're saying at the time, you were not personally worried about repercussions, about kicking up antibodies, and that the organization wasn't really concerned about it either.
Nor were our donors. Our donors included people who were very tied to the old system. They wanted change. They saw that they were flying around in circles going nowhere.
So the emperor had no clothes, but you were the only ones that wanted to say it.
A lot of people wanted to say it. A lot of people didn't know how to say it. They didn't have the tools. They didn't have the skills to say it effectively.
Okay.
Most of the people I talked to when I spent all those Wednesdays making phone calls were a remarkably inarticulate group of people. I understood what they were talking about. We're not going to put them in front of a camera and let them talk to the media. it was obviously a big problem. We were a very dorky group of people, and we were geeks and proud of it. Long before geeks were popular.
I forget when Revenge of the Nerds came out, but it used to be in the 80s that the nerds and the geeks were not at the top of the social
definitely not.
That comes later. That's a whole different thing. So, all right. So you're out there stirring things up, sending Reverend Rick out to go preach. It's been a couple years now. Your colleague Lori is running NSS, and you like, hey, great, you can go do that. I'm going to create a splinter group. So fine, go do that. But there still is a community of like-minded individuals, even if you disagree. So like, besides your other co-founders, can you describe what the community of people that you were working with and sometimes working against were like?
Well, the early advocates overwhelmingly came from Space Studies Institute, which had a senior associate program that's very similar to the advocates. I think I called up every senior associate. If I left any out, it was by mistake. We also would go to NSS conference and recruit people at the NSS conferences, usually the people who were upset, angry, and disheartened, Apollo's children, which of course made the organization edgier and edgier as we grew. Expect an organization to moderate as it grows, but the opposite happened with us early on. Intentionally organized as a guerrilla band because everybody was part-time. And so we form a group to do a press release. And it was just a one-off group. These 3 or 4 people are going to produce the press release, and we give them the authority to do it, which is kind of a scary thing to do because they might choose to do something weird. And they did sometimes, but we just lived with it. And it was quite some time before we started attracting advocates who wanted to moderate what we were saying. The 3 of us were very conscious of how we delivered our message. We always wear suits, and I kept my hair short at the time. But I was in business. I had to keep my hair short anyway. But we didn't moderate the message. We moderated the delivery, and we're careful in the way we spoke and the way we wrote. I went back and looked at some of our early press releases. I'm still impressed with what a good job we did finding that balance between being negative enough to get attention, but not being so negative that that people see it as dishonest or over the top.
Say some more about that, because there are plenty of people in this industry today that see problems with the way of the world. They may be angry. If you're talking to some of these people that are today angry that the world's not better, how would you coach that appropriate moderation?
I already mentioned, I've lost interest in talking to the space aware and within the space community. I mean, obviously, we need to keep talking about ourselves, but we really need to start reaching out beyond that community. And I think there are 3 very basic problems with the way we talk about space, all of which come from the fact that we spend most of our time talking to each other. First, which I've mentioned, is we're a community that's comfortable with the language of math, science, and engineering. The vast majority of decision makers in our society are not comfortable with math, science, and engineering, and can be very vocal about it. Secondly, we wrongly assume that the things we find compelling about opening the space frontier, other people also find compelling. Those people in our community want to go. I don't want to go. I'm an outdoor person. The idea of living in a can is offensive to me. But maybe when we build space colonies, I don't want to go. 10 million type of things, big ones, because I want to go outside. If I go to a conference for 2 days, I'm unhappy to get outside. And the third thing we do wrong is we advocate for space. Now, I know this is strange coming from somebody who spent the last 45 years advocating. We should do a lot less advocating. We'd be much more successful if we did more education and less advocacy. Because the truth is that what we really have to sell, what we're really doing in space, is popular people. They just don't know we're really doing it. Even when they support the things we're doing, they often oppose the way we're doing them. A lot of people tell you they think it's a good idea to provide broadband to rural places in poor parts of the world. But then they'll turn around and tell you how much they hate all those satellites cluttering up the space. In my view, what we need to do is 3 things. We need to use ordinary language. We need to figure out who our target audience is before we talk to them, what they're interested in. And we have to restrain our advocacy tendencies and focus on facts that matter to the larger audience.
And you put all of that under the umbrella of because we talk to ourselves.
It all arises because it's so gratifying to talk to ourselves.
Oh,
we
God,
all love going to
because
these conferences, right? And the reason we love going to the conferences is because we get to talk to other people enthusiastic about the same things we're enthusiastic about. That doesn't work when talking to other people.
right. It is great and it is important and it is, I would think, necessary. I mean, you stopped talking about space to your non-space people because they just didn't get
They
it.
weren't listening. Now I can get them to
So
listen.
you've changed enough of the conversation, but that same feeling that someone else may have of, I really am excited about this space thing, but I can't, Thanksgiving dinner is never focused on the right things because they want to talk about space, but they're talking about it in a 1950s mindset rather than what we're doing today. And so
Well, actually,
I think
I think problem with what we're doing today is what we're doing. Because our civil space programs are not doing anything that matters to people. They actually are doing some things that matter to people. They are doing the environmental monitoring, but that's a pretty small part of the budget. Very few people that I've seen no contrary evidence that there's just not that many people that care about going to Mars.
So
I mean, in our community, everybody's agreed that that's what we're going to do. But the rest of the world is saying, okay, that's what they're doing, but why are we paying for it?
All right. So your three things were, let's hit them again because I want to pick at this and I want to kind of connect it back to maybe what you did in the 80s and 90s. So it was not being too technical. The second one was making sure you're focusing on what the benefits are to the audience.
And educate,
third one,
educate rather than advocate.
Educate. Okay, good. All right. Ordinary language. Hold on. Are you familiar with XKCD? This is a web comic. He did several years ago, did a humorous explanation of the Saturn V, which he called the Upgoer 5. He used only common words to describe how the Saturn rocket worked. So,
I'm looking at it on my screen. It's cool.
Yeah, I love, and KCD is, I believe the author Randall worked at NASA for some time. And so he's got the technical, but he also can talk to a general audience. Okay, so we need to put him in charge.
A different mistake, which is talking about how rather than the who, what, and why. Because most people are much more interested in who, what, and why than they are in how. Our community is more interested in how than anything else.
Did you find then or now that because our space colleagues sometimes feel isolated, that the draw of having communal language that is a gatekeeper, some of it is because we might think that way, but some of it might be because that helps differentiate those of us who are in space from those people who are not.
Absolutely. When talking amongst ourselves, we casually use all kinds of references from technology and some science fiction as well. Yeah. This is a community where I have no trouble using a word like grok, right? Everybody knows what it means. I don't even know if it's in the dictionary. My guess is it's not, because most people use the word of grok and they look at you like, what? It comes from Stranger, I think? I know where it comes from. It comes from some science fiction novel. When we named the foundation, everybody in the community knew it was an Asimov reference. Nobody outside the community knew that. We thought this was obvious. They thought it was obscure.
Just in case, those who might be watching this that don't know what that reference is, mention who Isaac Asimov is.
Well, Asimov is obviously very influential to our community. Rick and I actually had dinner with him one time. With him, Jerry O'Neill, and a few other people. It was really it was a great dinner.
And so the foundation, the book series, there's multiple books in it. There is I forget which streaming service has done a interpretation of that, but yes.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
It's we'll call it an interpretation. Save that for a different discussion. But so steeped in language, that is a way for us in the industry to feel a sense of belonging in a world where a lot of people don't see the benefits that we see. Is that as true now as it was then?
Oh, more so, because the language it has become more involved. So one of the things that people tell you is you can't explain the rocket equation without math. Okay? I'll tell you how. If I can believe that. So at the front of every atlas, or the back of every atlas. Remember atlases? Books filled with paper maps for a younger audience. This is one of these nice charts that tells the distance between two places. And this is very useful on it because there's a very good correlation between the highway distance and how long it's going to take. Pretty good idea how much gas you're going to have to put in the car. You have a pretty good idea how many nights you're going to have to stay on the road. And figure all that stuff out just by looking at a simple chart like that. And that doesn't work for specs. All those things disconnect. And then, you can explain to somebody about something like delta V without wading into the rocket equation. Just say it's disconnected. Yeah. It's not like it is on Earth. And they don't really need to know much more than that. And they can understand, when you explain to them that it takes less fuel to get from orbit to the moons of Mars than it does and back, than it does to get from orbit to Earth's Luna and back. That makes no sense, of course, but it's a fact. And you can explain that these disconnects exist. You can explain to them about the importance of latency. We measure distance around the solar system in light minutes and light seconds because it's important. People who, we don't care how many kilometers away it is. We care very much what the latency is when we want to control our machinery that's someplace far away. A latency of a few seconds, people can understand that that's not going to work for a gamer. And a latency of a few minutes is not going to work for a conversation.
No.
They don't need to understand any of the math that goes with all that. You can explain these things in simple language. I call all this solography, by the way. I decided it's really just the geography of the solar system. Geography, you can think of as the relationship between civilization and its physical environment.
All right.
And solography is the relationship between civilization and the rest of the solar system. I made it
all right. So we need
because geography of the solar system seems awkward.
The New York City subway map, if you were to layer it over top of where the actual tracks are,
you're right.
It is completely inaccurate.
No, it's completely inaccurate.
So from a technical standpoint, it is useless, and you should never be using the subway map if you are trying to lay track. But it's the interpretation of it, the thing that matters to the audience. So
let's pivot to talk about this. The Museum of Modern Art took the original drawing of the subway map and put it on the wall for everyone to see, as if it was a work of art, because it really is a work of art, not a map.
So we need to have language. What is your observation about how we talk to this broader audience? We need to get, okay, so we're going to, in this future state, we're going to have better language and we'll be able to get outside of the bubble. But as we speak to a broader audience, besides language, what is the thing that you found was important then you'd also think we should be doing now, talking to this broader audience?
Then I would say that we were pretty much ineffective at talking to people's audience, that they just changed the channel, they walked away, and that we ended up only talking to the space community, which was really a test that was at hand, because we wanted, at the time, the civil space program worked actively against private space efforts. We need to change the conversation within the space community so we can allow room for new space to be birthed and grow. Now that we've done that, I think it makes sense to try and talk to the broader community. And ultimately, what you want to achieve is changing what's politically viable. So right now, it's politically viable to use NASA for work because nobody really cares that much. If enough people start caring about the results that you're getting, then maybe you can have a better discussion about things like prizes and data purchases and so forth. Things that we've long known would be dramatically more effective and would advance things, way quicker than we're currently advancing. I mean, really, if there was a prize to put people on the moon for 5 years, it would happen almost right away. It's not really that hard to do compared to the amount of money that we're spending.
True.
We're spending tens of billions of dollars to do something that $1 billion prize could make happen.
But the Google Lunar X Prize didn't put a robot on the moon.
Lunar X Prize wasn't enough money and it didn't last long.
I'd agree with both.
If I was designing a prize program for government, they would spend the money, they put it in an escrow account because nobody believes the government will actually meet their obligations. And every year they'd add to the escrow account until somebody does it. So eventually it reaches the number that somebody will do it at. And you also need to provide money for second and third prizes too, because you don't want a win-take-all situation.
Okay.
Prizes can be well designed, and we know that multi-million-dollar prizes work for small things. And there's every reason to believe that multi-billion-dollar prizes work for big things. If I thought flags and footprints on Mars was important, then I'd say, well, we should just have a prize for flags and footprints on Mars, and someone will go do it.
someone's kind of doing it. Isn't SpaceX doing that?
Sort of, kind of, eventually.
Talk to me about speaking to a broader audience. So back then, you needed to talk to the space. You needed to change the conversation in the industry about space. Right. Now, we need to change you think one of the challenges ahead of, I don't know if it's the industry or the society or the species, but is to change the conversation about the benefits of space?
Well, I think it's part of a broader, we need to bring space into the broader conversation that's already ongoing about how we survive. It's
existential.
It's clearly existential. The existential problem of the 21st century is that we have the ability to destroy our planet and destroy ourselves, and are we going to survive? So far we've managed to avoid having a biological or nuclear war. We need to keep that up. But we haven't done so well with preserving the environment. We're fouling the air, misusing the land, and abusing the oceans on a massive scale. There's a lot of focus on climate change these days. That's a good thing, but climate change is a small part of the problem. You really need to address the larger problem, which is how do we live with so many people on this planet and manage it effectively? The way we put it in the Foundation Credo is we want to use the nearly unlimited resource of the solar system to create a future that's freer, fairer, and more prosperous. I mean, those aren't the exact words, but
amen.
To me, that's a goal. If that were NASA's goal, it would deserve much more public support than it gets now. But if you actually look at the NASA Act, you'll see that that's not NASA's goal. No. There's a long list of goals, none of which much of anybody cares about. Few of which anyone knows are NASA goals, including people at NASA and including Congress. Because the NASA Act is way underread. People read it, they say, we're not supposed to be doing that.
You're adding to my reading list. I don't know the last time I read the... But
it's been modified several times, but they just keep adding new goals. They never get rid of the old ones.
Yeah. And yes, it's if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And talk to me about this last of your three things, which is less advocacy, more education. I'm not convinced of this one, so convince me that...
I want to be clear that I think that it makes sense to scream as loudly as possible about pork in the space field because it attracts attention outside the space.
Okay.
And I know it upsets people within the space community, but I think it makes sense to do it because it attracts attention outside the space community.
Okay.
As you know, I think we should be attacking the SLS. Well, maybe not every day, but every other day. It's a ridiculous program. It's ridiculous on the face of it. People can see that it's ridiculous. It's a great way to attract attention. But once you attract their attention, you need to convey a message that they care about. And depending on the audience, I think the messages that work best are the environmental message and the military message. I think that very few people, including those who are into the military, are aware of what the military is doing in space. If they know that there's a Space Force, it's only because it's a joke. I mean, the idiots who named it the Space Force obviously don't care that it's a joke. I don't know. And of course, the environmental angle, which a lot of people care about. There's a truly wonderful satellite that the Brits just put up that's measuring the energy leaking out of every house in the UK. And that's pretty cool. Something that people can understand. They can understand that that's data that's pretty hard to get from the ground. You could do with drones, but it would take many years and cost a fortune.
Yep.
Yeah, they built a small satellite that's going to do every house in the UK in a couple of years. And we'll do them again.
All right, so in this world, do you really think there's people that don't know that space is out there? Like, it seems to me like the appeal to education is shiny because people who love space love to talk about space, and therefore they can say, "Oh, I'm educating kids." Is there a nuance to that education? What is that education that you're talking about? Is it math and science education, or is it something else?
Listen, I certainly think we need to do a better job of math and science education with kids, but with grown-ups, we're not going to achieve that. We bemoan scientific literacy as if it's necessary to function, to be scientifically literate to function in society. Well, most of the people I know who function just fine in society don't have any scientific literacy at all. They know almost nothing about space and about science and technology, and what little they think they know is wrong. And of course, there's a large minority in our society that is actively opposed to science and technology. And they make decisions too. And I think we need to find ways of talking about space that finesses the need for science and technology completely. I think we also need to be, with kids, it's a great way to get kids interested in science and technology. We do need to get more kids interested in science and technology. But we're never going to succeed in getting the majority interested.
And if all of our space education is just about inside, if all of our education is routing more people into the bubble, then we fail in that getting it outside and conveying that message elsewhere.
Well, that's why I created an area called solography, because now there's something that's not science. Right now, we teach about space in science class. So naturally, it's oriented towards teaching kids about science. I met a calculus teacher who teaches in space. All the problems he used in his AP calculus class were for a fountain on a rotating space column. He spent the whole semester putting the fountain on the rotating space column and did integral and derivatives. Kids learned how to design a fountain on a rotating space column.
That's kind of cool.
It is kind of cool, but also sort of trivial. I mean, I guess better than learning it by following the track for cannonball. I've never actually seen a cannonball fly. I've seen cannons blown up, but not with balls in them. So
I think the only ones would have been Wile E. Coyote, and I do not trust the physics.
But we still use Isaac Newton's cannonball because we've been using it ever since Isaac Newton's time. And it's on a tower. It's a cannonball on a tower because that's what Isaac Newton threw a picture of, a cannonball on a tower. And we all still use a cannonball on a tower.
Be careful what might stick.
It works. I'm not complaining. But I think that if you start talking about solography in the same way you talk about geography, you can start teaching people basic facts about the solar system that matter to them. I mean, does a person really need to know any math or science to know the atmosphere has no top? A few hundred kilometers, you're going to fall down in a week, and a couple hundred more, you're going to fall down in a month. They don't need to know any math or science to know that the atmosphere just gets thinner and thinner and thinner. You just need to be taught. It's an important fact. It's as important a fact about our civilization as the shape of our coastlines and stuff. There's a lot of stuff floating around through the upper atmosphere, very high upper atmosphere, that needs to get reboosted all the time. I've been reading stuff lately about debris. Average science writer writing about debris doesn't know that stuff at 200 kilometers is going to fall down on its own. They don't know that because, they went to journalism school.
Right.
They didn't study science.
And if you start out the conversation with a formula with the little curly brackets and all that stuff, then you'll lose.
Before you start. I tried to explain the rocket equation to many people over the years, and I always fail. But when I switched to showing them my little chart, they said, "Oh, okay, I get it."
Bob, I really appreciate all the work back then and all of the time now. In rounding this out, besides a windowless room, do you have anything else that stands out, like from a personal challenge or something? Like what did your time in the foundation do for you? Like what was the Bob coming out of that work versus the Bob that started it?
A lot of things changed. Many of my closest friends are from that community and so forth. But I think the thing that was most impactful most quickly is that I became a much better manager. When you manage volunteers, you really need to get buy-in. And I carried that over into my business. It made me a much better manager. And I would argue a better person. How much that translates into profits over the ensuing years, it's hard to say. But it certainly translated into a more gratifying work environment.
And that's
a good thing.
Amen.
And I would urge anybody who's in business to find a way to spend 1 or 2 days a week working for a nonprofit, because you're doing so much in a nonprofit environment that you can't possibly learn running your own business.
I will agree with that. Bob, is there anything that the foundation, or anyone who's watching this can do for you? Because I appreciate the time, but I also want to make sure that we're thinking of things that would be beneficial for you. How can we return the favor?
If any of you are a book agent or a publisher, publish my book, which I'm writing.
I will add that I am not a book publisher, but I can send some faxes and maybe. I got
anybody receive faxes anymore?
Bob, thank you very much for the
My pleasure.
time, for the reminiscing, for the personal insights. Greatly appreciate it. And best of luck in whatever the next part of the endeavor is.
And thank you for taking on the foundation, because I don't want to do it anymore.
My pleasure to serve.
Take care.
Thanks, Bob.
Well, that was pretty great, right?
I know. As I keep saying, I keep learning more things each time I have one of these conversations, and I love listening to it again. I can pick up more pieces there. So, just in case there was any confusion, Bob Ross and Bob Werb are two different people, even though his hair is kind of gone that direction. And yes, I did steal that joke from you. So.
Yeah.
But no, it's cool because, Bob, by the time I got involved in the industry, Bob wasn't nearly as present as Jim and Rick were, as the three founders. Like, I knew of him by his reputation, but I didn't have as much time to interact with him, which,
I've known of him for nearly 20 years, but I've not just sat down and hung out with him or talked to him. He was really helpful to the Center for Space Commerce and Finance, which I'm on the board of. He graciously writes checks on a pretty frequent basis once a year for that, so that's really nice to see. But no, most of the stories that we just heard were absolutely new to me and really interesting. I do want to point out in the chat, Al Differ, Jeffrey Mamber, somebody else. I lost it. Drat. Joe Burris. All of you folks really appreciate that you're here. This part is live, so thanks very much. For the Space Frontier Foundation's Pioneers of Space Commercialization series, what we're doing is we're capturing those prior, right? Sometimes days, sometimes weeks in advance, editing them, bringing them to you as a recording. So sorry if that was misleading or confusing, but we will. Sean assures me that he will pass your hellos and highs onto Werb. So it was great. So Sean, what were some of your takeaways there? I know you were taking notes during the interview originally. Now you've heard it again. What were some things that surprised you? There were a few things that surprised me.
It's not that crazy to just say we just picked up the phone, or that's for all the highfalutin, crazy technology, rocket, blah blah blah. It boiled down to picking up the phone and talking to people, and while I do think that the times, the world has moved on in no small part because of the work that Bob and all the other folks we're going to be talking to have done, that talking to people outside the space family or the space bubble really resonates. And so as we're thinking about what we should be doing next, that's a big part of it. I don't think we're going to use fax machines, but I've taken some inspiration from that. I have a pretty broad range of interests, and I have started, anytime I hear something that seems to be an intellectual, someone who's actually thinking deeply about an issue, whether it's a podcast or an article or someone on the street, doesn't matter. I take that as an opportunity to reach out and say, hey, I appreciate the perspective you were offering in this. Do you have any thoughts about how that topic would apply to space,
Right.
because I'm part of the space group, and then I think there's some things there. And so I've started doing that in my regular day to day, and I had some really interesting conversations, and have helped take space beyond the tribe. So that's one of the things that, even if I don't necessarily want to pick up the phone.
One of the things I liked, you said the phrase facts that speak to the target audience. Well, first of all,
Yeah.
identifying the target audience is maybe a trick all by itself, but then
Yeah.
Educate instead of advocate, right? Those two things kind of go side by side with each other. There's some lessons to learn from the guys who are here first, building the foundation, both the foundation that we're a part of, but also the foundation of this, this commercialization of space across not just the United States, but now that model has moved around the world as well, right? And somebody has to be that first snowflake that becomes a snowball, that becomes an avalanche, that moves the mountain. And to talk to folks like Werb, who are actually the people doing it, I think it's pretty amazing.
And this is not something that is brand new to space. I mean, part of my first career is someone who could translate between the geeks in the computer lab and the business people who were trying to figure out what to do with this whole web thing, right? Like, it was translating between, and it was about knowing, and it is not saying a different story. It is figuring out the parts of the value that matter to different people, right? So it's, some people think, oh, well, you should say the same thing to everyone, because that way you're not, spinning something or equivocating. But no, there's a difference there. Like, know your audience is, and figure out how to best present to them. And that was one of the things, Laurie talked about, her ability to be in the room and not stand out as one of those people, right? Like,
you mean Laurie Garver, Deputy Administrator of NASA, who was on our first program last week that everybody else should watch.
Yes, if you haven't already, first read the book, then watch the thing. But yeah, she talked about the fact that she was able to speak for this commercial space idea, but in a way that didn't immediately trigger some of the antibodies. Now, she absolutely triggered them. And how? But, that figuring out a way to make sure that the conversation gets started is really important. And I'm still figuring out how the various pieces manage to get in the position that they are, in order for us to enjoy the world that we have, that we live in today.
Well, and then again, for the folks that are tuning in for the first time, the point of this series is to take a look at the past. This is the 35th anniversary of the Space Frontier Foundation. Y'all, before I was there, when Werb was there, Muncie and Tomlinson and Garver and Spawnable, and like all of these people, right? Mamber we talked to today. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that one. All of these folks were in a completely different world. And I've been at it 20 years. You've been at it, I think, 15 years-ish. And we think we know stuff, but we definitely don't know this stuff. So I have really enjoyed this. But it's not just about looking backwards, right? The point of this is to figure out what lens did they use to make the decisions that they made at the time, and then bring that lens to the 21st century and say, okay, this is our last 35 years. What's our next 35 years? right? And that's
Yeah,
that's
'cause
every
we're not done.
no, I know that. We're not done. Absolutely. And so whenever I'm doing these interviews, I'm listening for what tomorrow sounds like, right?
Yeah.
What is the lens that we can see tomorrow through? So that's what I've been really paying attention to.
And it may mean some of the things might be the same battles. I mean, we don't have a shuttle program to worry about, but we also don't yet have the manifestation of commercial space stations. We're getting there, but so like some things have changed and others still need to change, and some tactics and approaches. It's important to know how they decided. Like, so asking, when I asked Bob, was like, did that affect your career? And he's like, no, I wasn't. That wasn't my career, right? But it's, is that the same thing that we're going to have now? Are the people, as we're advocating for the next sort of change, do we care? Do we want to have anonymous donors, or have we gotten past the point where you have to be like really careful about it, and now we need to say, okay, these are difficult conversations that we're going to have, but we can be present and not have to like worry about whether or not it's going to end a contract that we have or something like that. So it is a complex question that we get to deal with. So did you have anything in particular that really stood out to you as you were listening to it again?
Yeah, because I'm on the inside of this. I'm an old science fiction fan. In my different office, this is not my normal office. Just shelves and shelves and shelves of old science fiction, Heinlein, Asimov, Clarke, everybody. And so, yeah, we can use a phrase like grok in our language, and it's not weird, right? It's a little weird. It's a little weird because you're virtue signaling, I'm a nerd, you're a nerd, and we both speak nerd language, right? I want to point something out in the chat. So Al Difford just points something that I had not seen before. He's like, the reason some of our conferences were in Los Angeles was about reaching a particular target audience, Hollywood. I have gone to many of the LA events, San Francisco events, that I never got that conclusion. So that's actually goes right back to the facts to speak to the target audience. I didn't ever clue in that we were in LA to speak to Hollywood, although I do remember once that Lance Bass from NSYNC came to one of the Space Frontier Foundation meetings. So that worked. Okay. I just never connected those two things.
Yeah. And I know as I became involved, at the San Jose DoubleTree, that was there because it was in the Bay Area. It was Silicon Valley. It was intentionally there so that by that point, where the focus was commercial space and trying to make sure that we were tapping the organization was focused on fostering space companies, and the startup community in general and the investor community, broadly speaking, based there, was part of the reason. So, but I guess some of that does get lost. Even if it is said at the beginning of the conference, it's not something that people necessarily remember over time. And it's helpful for us, anyone who's going to be taking an active role now, to keep in mind these are some, like, what are the things that we've learned before? Which parts should what we're singing now be the same melody, and where should we make sure it's harmonizing, and understanding that, because that's important. And this whole world is still complex. I don't think there's anyone that's coming out of school or out of like early career that's like, oh, I understand how this market works.
There's
It's still not. We're not there.
Not there.
Nope.
There. I remember one of the earliest space investment summits / boot camps. We held it at I think it was NASA Ames. I think it was at NASA Ames Research Center, specifically to start to engage the investor community. So, all right, like let's think about who our target audiences are. What messages do we want to convey to them? Sean, it has come to a close. Is there anything that you would like to say? Next guest, next event, updates.
So next week we have a conversation with Jeff Kruken, who has a different. So he's not the founder, but he is someone that has his story fits inside of this same sort of era that we're looking at, and I think we get some real good personal insights into his journey and its ups and downs that I think people are going to really be interested to hear and may draw comfort from understanding the trials that he went through and the trials that we might be going through ourselves today. So check that out.
All right. Thanks a lot. Sean Mahoney, Executive Director of the Space Frontier Foundation. Thanks a lot, sir. Appreciate it. We'll see you next week.
Pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.